Previously, Sean volunteered to help take watch, so everyone immediately realized something was up. Keelan and Tornak took the first and second watches, with Keelan working on alchemy and Tornak on the brink of a mental breakdown from lack of sleep. Then Oz and Zaya joined Sean for third watch, where it was revealed that it was the anniversary of Sean's mother's death. Sean and Zaya talked for a bit, with Sean sharing a few stories and burning some roses she'd bought the day before when they left the city. Once everyone was awake, the group made their way back to the city. On the way back, a storm came out of nowhere, and Tornak started seeing visions of a figure walking around in the rain. He then walked out into the storm. Keelan and Oz went after him, trying to pull him back under shelter, so they were all hit when a lightning bolt came down and struck Tornak directly on. The miner they'd rescued, a teenage boy, panicked a bit as he noticed Tornak casting magic during the whole event. Oz was able to gently intimidate him into quieting down, considering the group had saved him. They eventually made it back to the city late in the day, where they reunited the boy with his family and collected their reward. They also found out that the miner's family owned a forge in the city, and his father was more than willing to let Taria borrow it for a few days. Taria headed up to her room to change into clothing more appropriate for the hot springs. An exhausted Tornak also headed up to try, and fail, to sleep. The others gathered together downstairs for a quick talk. They decided that Keelan and Oz would head out to see if they could find an open alchemy shop. Zaya headed upstairs to babysit Tornak, while Sean stayed downstairs by herself. In the suite, Zaya heard Taria trying to impersonate various group members in her room, and an awkward moment ensued before Taria ran away. Hurried out to the hot springs. Keelan and Oz ducked into the suite to drop off some things before heading out, and Keelan took a moment to pop into Tornak's room. He was clearly not doing well mentally, and he ended up telling Keelan about his brother who had died trying to protect him. Tornak was certain he'd seen him in the storm earlier, and that he was trying to get in touch with him. He showed Keelan a letter he'd had on him, written in Primordial, that had been charred by the lightning strike. The group split up for a bit, with Keelan and Oz heading to the apothecary as planned. They got there just before it closed for the night, and the proprietor helped Keelan figure out what he'd need, although he couldn't afford to pay for it just then. There was more talk in the suite later that night regarding Tornak and whatever was going on with him in the storm. Later, once everyone headed off to bed, Taria slipped into Tornak's room to talk for a bit. He showed her the letter that he'd shown Keelan, and she cast Comprehend Languages to read it. The lightning-looking marks on it were written Primordial that said, "I'm still here for you, and I always will be." Elsewhere, in her own room, Sean used Disguised Self to make herself look like her mother so she could see her in the mirror. Eventually, everyone went to sleep for the night, and the air of the suite filled with the scent of roses. The next morning, the group bought a newspaper, sold some gems, made a potion out of mushrooms, and managed to cure Tornak before he quite literally died of exhaustion. Since he needed time to recover, the group settled in to spend the next few days working on various things. Taria spent her downtime working with the mithril ore she'd gotten from the cave. Zaya, Sean, and Oz headed out to find the Amethyst Alpaca, which was the breaker bar that they'd been told about. Sean then headed out on her own for a bit to gamble and eavesdrop in taverns across the city. She noticed more and more Red Sun posters and the like, and it was clear that the city was a powder keg. Oz and Zaya spent some time together, giving them the chance to talk for a bit. At another point, Oz headed out to try to increase his cooking knowledge, and by pure luck and happenstance and maybe a nat 20, managed to not only get to have dinner at a very fine dining restaurant, but also help the chef in the kitchen as well. At one point, Oz went off by himself to inspect the dagger he'd been given. It gave him a vision of a hag, and he knew deep down inside that he'd get everything he wanted if he just killed her. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Keelan spent a lot of time by himself, much of it spent in the hot springs. Near the end of the downtime, once Tornak was mostly back to normal for him, he gave Taria some money so that she could buy some fancy inks. Then she spent the day painting the shield she'd made for him and giving him a tattoo. And that is where we left off.